So let's look at serialization in Web API and how formatting is really separate from the controllers themselves. If we look at what we're dealing with here, we're returning just a simple collection of food from the controller method itself. How does it know that we want JSON here? Well, let's use Fiddler to figure that out. See, here in Fiddler, we can compose a very specific request to the server. We can see here I have our API foods, and we're just going to issue a plain old GET to it. When we execute it, it's going to show up on the left-hand side with the result, with 200 meaning OK, and then we can actually look at what was returned. We look at the JSON that was returned, we can see that it was actually returning JSON just like we did in the browser. And the reason it returned JSON is the way that Web API is set up. If the caller to the service doesn't specify what kind of data it wants, it defaults back to JSON because that's such a common case. If we change our request over here to use a header called accept, we're going to tell it what kind of data we can accept. And if I say text/XML, which is the data type for XML, and I execute it, we can see that the raw data that's returned is now XML. And in XML, we can see we're getting the same data, but it's being formatted in an XML document itself. So it's really up to the caller to specify what kind of formatting it wants. You can actually specify, and this is often the case, several accepts. So I can say text XML, application JSON, and let's say text./HTML. I can accept all of these, and they're ordered in that way so that Web API is going to take the first one that it knows how to use as a format. And when we execute this format, it's going to take the one that we on the server have said is our preferred format to return, and in that case, the first formatter is actually JSON. It's going to take a look at the array of the accept headers and find the one that most matches our preferences on the server. So in this case, when we execute it, we're going to see that it actually returns JSON again. So it is up to the caller to specify what kind of data, and in that way Web API uses these classes called formatters to figure out how to format the documents. This means you can have your own formatting. There are formatters out there for HTML, for binary, for CSV, etc. So you can really craft your own set of formatting, but the controllers themselves don't end up needing to change because all the code in the controller is for is to get what needs to be returned and to send it back through the pipeline of Web API for the formatters to do their work. So being able to manipulate those formatters becomes useful. For example, we have a pretty common case where what the formatter is doing for JSON is taking the name of each of those properties and the food object, which happens to have three properties, a description, an ID, and then a collection of measures that we're not returning yet. In this case, we notice the objects that are returned are Pascal cased because in .NET, our property names are Pascal case, so that they start with an initial cap instead of being what's called camel cased, which is starting with a lowercase letter that is a little friendlier to people consuming it with JavaScript, which is probably going to be the majority of people that you're going to be dealing with. So instead of having to make some change and to model the data in a different way to get you these lowercase characters, we can really deal with the formatters themselves. Let's go ahead and do that. If we go back to the configuration for Web API, let's go ahead and add some code down here to get the JSON formatter. And we can get this by just calling the config object that was passed into register. And we're going to look for a specific type of formatter called a JSON media type formatter. These formatters have this notion of media type or the types that are coming in. So when I changed the accept header, it was specifying the different kinds of media types that we could accept. So that means I know that there's a JSON media type formatter in our system built in already, and I'm going to go ahead and get the first one, which is usually the only one that is specified there. And I'm going to make a change. I'm going to tell the formatter that when it serializes it with the serialize settings, I want to use a specific contract resolver. Now, a contract resolver is a piece of the API. You don't need to get into how all these different pieces work together, but this is a really common case that you're going to do in a majority of your projects. We're going to change the contract resolver to a new one that is shipped with JSON.NET called a camel case property names contract resolver. This comes from the JSON.NET folks, so that it knows that when it resolves each of those property names in our objects, to go ahead and make them camel cased. By making this small change to that formatter, if we go ahead and reissue our code here, we'll see that our property names are now camel cased. If the description were full description, it would be a small f and a capital D. It's called camel case because it can have humps in the middle. It has humps wherever a new logical word is, but that it's always going to start with an initial lowercase letter. One of the reasons for making this change is that because many of your consumers of the API are going to be using JavaScript, you're writing web pages, people are writing JavaScript plugins for things like Node, or even for some platforms in building mobile development, camel-cased return objects are going to be easier for them to use because they're going to be more naturally looking for camel-cased objects that are common in JavaScript programming. Now that we have some basic data being returned, let's go back to the server code and clean it up a little by introducing dependency injection.